interrupted with the dreadful news of the fateful accident of the Apollo 1 crew. So it's always important to remember everybody who's contributed and those exceptionally so. So thanks for the opportunity to join in. I've been fortunate to be involved with lots of flight research for over 30 years, medically oriented research, initially studying how the heart and the circulation adapt to the weightless environment of spaceflight using some interesting research techniques. And more recently, I and the project team that I'm a part of have been focusing on developing advanced healthcare capabilities for exploration spaceflight, including surgery and blood transfusions. So we'll get to that in the presentation. And after that, I'll look forward to your questions. And if there's a little extra time at the end, I'll share with you a video that my students have made from some of our flying research that is both informative and I think you'll also find entertaining. So I am at the University of Louisville. Formerly, I was at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City for 17 years when I first started doing flight research in 1992. And then in 2000, I moved to Louisville and have continued that with wonderful student and faculty collaborators in the effort. For some reason, my slides aren't advancing.
Sometimes I've found people on PowerPoint have to use a different technique, like clicking or using arrow keys. We're still seeing the 0G picture.
Yeah, I'm trying the arrow keys. Let's see if clicking.
This happened with our first speaker too.
Okay, there. Okay, so apparently clicking on the slide is going to work. So by way of a brief introduction, I started out as a rocket nerd. As I suspect some of you may have, you've designed, built, and flown model rockets, both for great fun and maybe some competition, and I suspect 1 or 2 science fair projects. I can remember listening to Sputnik on my dad's shortwave radio when I was 5 years old. And when I heard that, I thought, gosh, this space flight stuff is really cool. I've got to figure out a way to get involved in it. And so model rockets, doing science for a project with wind tunnels and stuff like that was putting me on a fast track to getting a PhD in aerospace engineering. But there were some interesting twists along the way that eventually led me to transform from a rocket nerd to a cardiovascular surgery research nerd. If any of you are teachers, you might find the brief story somewhat curious. Since I was very directly oriented toward aerospace engineering when I got to high school in biology, sophomore year, most people took biology. Since I was going to be an aerospace engineer, I said, I don't need biology, so I convinced my advisor to let me jump past biology directly into chemistry and then physics for junior year. But my other classmates in the honors biology class with Mr. Webster, they took both a full curriculum in biology and did a special project. So given this was the fall of 1967, kidney transplant clinically had just started and heart transplant clinically were anticipated very, very soon. So they decided to study organ transplantation, and the project that they chose to do on the topic was to attempt a heart transplant on a bullfrog. Well, it was a very important learning experience for the class. Pardon the pun, but the frog croaked. But they learned so much that they wanted to try it again. But as they were reviewing everything that went well and things that they wish they would have done better during the first transplant experience, one of the things that came up was all they had to document it visually were 2 very bad black and white Polaroid photographs. And how I got involved was I happened to be the photographer for the school yearbook and newspaper. So they asked me if I would be willing to photograph a heart transplant And I naively, not knowing what I was getting into, agreed to help my friends like that. Turns out I had a study hall the same period. So I went in the next 6 weeks before the next implant. And I was struck by how some of the problems they encountered had engineering solutions. It's like, how do you make an operating room table that will keep a slippery frog from slipping off the table? So I developed an operating table both for the donor frog and the recipient frog using one of my favorite fasteners, which is Velcro, to create straps that would secure the frog. And if they ever tried to pull their leg away, it just tightened down further. Fortunately, that worked well. I also created my first cardiovascular device, which was an intraluminal insert so they could stick it in the donor and the recipient aorta to make it a lot easier to connect the blood vessels together, because microvascular surgery techniques, and of course I didn't even know that term at the time, had not been invented. But that got me thinking about maybe redirecting my path a little bit, because NASA wasn't going to have trouble finding aerospace engineers, but they might have trouble finding people in medical science that were also interested in spaceflight. So I redirected, I did a full curriculum in aerospace engineering, because biomedical engineering as an academic discipline was in its very early stages, not available where I went to school. But I got a chance to connect with a research group that was using engineering concepts to study the cardiovascular system and the pulmonary system. And so that helped me on the pathway to eventually doing some of the flight research that I'm going to share with you later. Eventually, I became a cardiovascular rocket nerd and got to fly with NASA many times on the zero-G airplane. By this time, I was on the faculty in surgery and bioengineering at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. And we had created a physical model of the cardiovascular system that had one of the artificial hearts that I developed at the artificial heart program there, pumping on this physical mock circulation. And we were looking at the influence of hydrostatic pressure that exists in 1G but goes away in 0G on the filling phase called diastole of the heart. And here you can see a photo of one of my flight opportunities floating in 0G over my experiment. Or to pardon the pun, for once I was on top of my research. Now, opportunities for doing research in reduced gravity are several. There are such things as drop towers, which, as they describe, they're either big holes in the ground where you drop your payload, and depending on how deep it is, it's 2 to 5 seconds of high quality reduced gravity, getting very, very, very close to zero. Other places have built tall towers where you hoist your payload up and then drop it down through the tower. The great thing is you get a brief exposure to microgravity. Tough thing is when you hit the impact cushion at the bottom of the tower, it's anywhere from 12 to 16 Gs. So you need to have a pretty strong experiment package. But if you can do that, it's a great way to get some initial data on whatever it is you're looking at in reduced gravity. Parabolic flight, which essentially is an airplane in the sky flying a 10 to 12,000 foot roller coaster, and you get 15 to 20 seconds of 0G as you're coasting over the top. All the cabin is cleared of seats. The experiments are bolted to the deck of the cabin so they don't float away. And I've done many, many different kinds of biomedical research and helped other people with other kinds of research in parabolic flight. Suborbital flight, as we currently have it with the commercial providers, that being Galactic and Blue Origin, that gives you about 3 minutes of sustained microgravity. So that's more opportunity for a sustained microgravity experience. And then low Earth orbit, if you're lucky enough to get on orbit, in this case, usually going to the International Space Station, that's days to years of exposure to microgravity. If you're going to go to the lunar surface, which is 1/6G, that would be days to years. And if you're going interplanetary, that's reduced gravity or zero gravity. for a year or more, depending on where you're headed and the flight path that you're following to get there. So starting with drop towers, we needed, for an experiment that we were going to fly on, with Virgin Galactic on their suborbital spacecraft, we were developing a technique with our microprocessor that fortunately had accelerometers built into it to reliably detect entry into microgravity, to then activate our experiment protocol and to start to get confirmational data that our four-step algorithm worked. We had a small experiment package that you can see on the left, which had our microprocessor and the 3-axis accelerometer in there. And then independently, we had a separate 1-axis accelerometer. And we recorded data from both devices, drop, during the drop, and after the impact of the drop, to document the level of reduced gravity and also that the algorithm correctly detected in a matter of less than a second that we had in fact entered microgravity. The reason why this is important in some suborbital flights is that you oftentimes, before you get to the microgravity, you go through a period of 1G during the climb to release altitude, in the case of Virgin Galactic. And then when Spaceship Two drops from the carrier aircraft White Knight 2, you get a period of reduced gravity, sometimes very briefly passing through 0G. And then power descent starts when they let a rocket motor with acceleration up to 6G. And what we wanted to be sure was we didn't actually start the experiment protocol during power descent after that very brief period of microgravity. So we had a way of figuring out how to do that. So then once the rocket motor burned out, you entered microgravity within a couple of seconds, the algorithm would correctly detect sustained microgravity, and then it would initiate our experiment protocol. So on the right, you can see the gondola that the experiments go into. The gondola is all covered up, and then that rectangular hole in the floor is pulled away, and then the latch system releases, and it fell 78 feet down to the impact cushion, and we did about 2.2 seconds, very close to microgravity, which was very sufficient for what we did. The nice thing about it is we wound up doing 9 drops in one day, so we had multiple opportunities to challenge the algorithm by doing a few things with each drop. The other cool thing was using Bluetooth, we could actually telemeter the acceleration data as the drop was proceeding. So we could watch the acceleration response as it was going through the drop. So by the time we left, and this, I should mention, this drop tower was up at the NASA Glenn Research Center in Cleveland, Ohio. And by the time we left at the end of the day with data from 9 drops, we were pretty confident that the algorithm we had for our suborbital flight was going to be viable. Yeah, this gives you an example of the acceleration tracing. You can see the blue section on the left, a couple of seconds of 1G, and then on release, the rapid drop to 0G with the gray and the orange, 2 different accelerometer packages. And then you can see the great spike. In this case, you see about 8 or 9 Gs, but with higher resolution, it got up to about 12. And then eventually back to 1G after the impact oscillations damped out. So this was very useful information for us. Now, the next technique for reduced gravity flight research that I mentioned was parabolic flight. And what you see here is NASA 930. It's a modified Boeing 707 or KC-135A, for those of you familiar with air refueling tankers that the Air Force uses. And it's reinforced both for extra strength as well as some modifications to the flight controller so that it could fly a very predictable and smooth arc as it went through the sky. Typically, when we were flying with NASA, we would fly 4 sets of 10 parabola in a mission, so you have 40 opportunities to get exposure to zero G to test out whatever it was you needed. In our case, it was a cardiovascular experiment. They can also change the angle of approach and simulate lunar gravity for about 25 to 30 seconds and Martian gravity for about 30 to 40 seconds. And as we're now talking about going back to the moon and eventually going to Mars, it's very fortunate that you can create those different levels of acceleration to test out whatever it is that you need that's going to impact your research or your activity on the moon or on the surface of Mars. If you've never seen it before, the schematic shows the flight profile that a parabolic flight encounters. In this case, this is from Zero G, which is a commercial company. Most of their research flights take place either Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and sometimes they fly out in California. This is an alternative provider parabolic flights that is now available. In fact, we'll be flying 2 flights with them in the first of March. So one of the first opportunity for me to do parabolic flight research was with the Hearts in Space program. At that time, I was at the University of Utah, and we had collaborators at Utah State and Logan and Bellarmine College in Louisville, Kentucky. And the question that we were looking at, you're looking at a picture in the Space Shuttle middeck. On the left is Dr. Ray Seddon, who was a physician astronaut. On the right is a willing test subject to capture echocardiograph images of his heart for the very first time that it was possible in spaceflight. It happened to be Senator Jake Garn, who was my senator from Utah, who of course was on a congressional fact-finding mission in space. But fortunately, he was a willing volunteer, as were 3 other of the crew members. So look at 4 test subjects. And what you can see here on the very left is the pre-flight supine data. And then the initial bump up is the stroke volume and the volume of the heart. First day of the mission, and then every day following as the mission progressed, and then up to 4 days every day. And what you can see initially is that the stroke volume, or the amount of blood per beat that the heart pumped, was increased initially in the flight, as was the filling volume of the heart. But as the mission progressed, eventually those went below the pre-flight supine conditions to about 15 to 20% less. And then with return to gravity, they're at L0 through L+4. Eventually, they got pretty much back to the pre-flight levels. So there's 2 very obvious questions: is what causes the increase initially, and then what causes the reduced filling and pumped stroke volume after adaptation to microgravity. Both of those have very complex answers. So with our first experiment, we decided to ask one very specific question, and that is, since hydrostatic pressure is acceleration dependent, when you go to a situation where acceleration is 0 and hydrostatic pressure goes away, does that influence the amount of blood that the heart fills with during the filling phase or diastole of every heartbeat? So then you would predict that the stroke volume, or the amount of blood that's produced by the following ejection or systole, would be lower. And so that could be one of the factors that contributes to the reduced stroke volume and diastolic volume you see after starting with about day 2. Now, the hydrostatic pressure goes to 0 the instant you go to 0 gravity. So there are probably other physiologic factors that exceed the consequence of the lack of hydrostatic pressure that initially make it increase. But then as other things change, then you can appreciate the lack of hydrostatic pressure and the lower filling. We could take all day to dissect all those details. I won't do that for now, but we'll just focus in on the hydrostatic pressure inside the heart for the next few slides. If you look at this diagram, you can see 5 different factors that contribute to filling of the heart. And the first is the filling pressure in the atrium, or the reception chamber above the heart, where blood is either coming back from the systemic circulation if you're looking at the right ventricle, or blood that's coming back from the lungs if you're looking at the left ventricle. This happens to be a drawing of the left ventricle and the aorta, but you'd have a similar drawing for the right ventricle. The second is the inertia of the blood. Factor number 2 there, as it enters the ventricle through the inflow valve called the mitral valve. Third is the pressure inside the chest, but outside of the heart. The heart is not a rigid structure, it's a flexible structure. And so the pressure in the chest is going to tend to draw it open if the pressure is subatmospheric or a little bit negative, or push the heart together if it's positive. A fourth factor is if you go down to the molecular cellular level of the heart muscles, which are called myocytes, there's an elastic structure on the outside, which is modeled as a parallel elastic element. And after the heart's filled, or after the heart's ejected to a smaller volume, then that passive elastic recoil helps to extend the muscle and there extend the volume, or extend the size of the ventricle to helping to draw blood in. And then the final factor is number 5, which is the hydrostatic pressure. And as you know, if you've ever dove into a swimming pool, if you go, the greater the pressure that you experience in the pool. Well, the same thing is that the deeper, quote unquote, you go in the ventricle, the hydrostatic pressure increases, and that's going to increase the pressure. It's going to promote expansion of the ventricle, which is going to draw more blood into it, increasing the stroke volume. So our hypothesis was everything else staying the same. If you go into 0G, and the hydrostatic pressure goes away, that factor that contributes to heart filling is going to go away. Therefore, the heart is going to fill less, and it's going to have less blood per beat to eject and deliver to circulation. And this is a simple diagram. Again, if you like math, a very simple equation for hydrostatic pressure. It's the product of the density of the fluid, in this case blood, which is just a little denser than water, times the acceleration factor, which for most of us is 1G, and then the change in the height, or the pressure head, it's called. And here you can see it shown for the pressure head ventricle, which if you plug the numbers into this equation, typically you're going to have a hydrostatic pressure of about 5 millimeters of mercury down at the bottom of the ventricle, which is called the apex. So an average effect across the size of the ventricle of about 2.5 millimeters of mercury, which seems like a very small pressure, but physiologically that's a sufficient pressure to impact the filling of the heart. Now, you might imagine most astronauts wouldn't be real excited about having blood pressure and blood flow probes implanted in and around their heart just before they lifted off in a rocket ship to go in orbit. So fortunately, we had a willing analog test subject, which we whimsically called our heart. It did have an artificial heart that was developed for clinical use to support patients in end-stage heart disease, but hooked up to mechanical elements and tubing that incorporated compliance and resistance elements, so that if you connected our heart to a patient monitor, you'd see a blood pressure tracing just like you would from a human patient. So it recreates reasonably normal physiologic blood pressure and blood flow. So we put the first mock circulation together, and here you can see the project team inside the KC-135 that I showed you picture of a few slides ago. In the front is the tray that contained our first effort mock circulation to do some initial measurements in 0G and all the people that were part of it. And you can see the instrumentation tower that was recording all of our pressure, flow, and acceleration data continuously throughout the flight. The goal ultimately was to create a condensed version of this cardiovascular system model that could fit inside a payload canister that's about the size of a 20-gallon garbage can. So with the first flights, we demonstrated that we could make the unit work in 0G. And we also gathered enough data that did document the change, the hydrostatic pressure in the heart going to 0 as we anticipated. And we also did see reduced filling of the ventricle consistent with our hypothesis. To gather more data and to develop the models so that it was small enough to fit into the gas can, as it was called. You can see here now it's been miniaturized. In this case, we've actually unbolted it from the deck of the aircraft so we could free float it to get away from some of the vibration artifact that sensors were sensitive enough to pick up on the airplane. Now, I'm going to pause the scientific explanation just to mention a little story that whenever you fly with NASA, sometimes it's pretty routine. Other times there are interesting things that happen. If you've ever seen the movie Apollo 13, you might recall there are several weightless scenes in the movie as we were watching the crew of Apollo 13 go from a routine mission to a crisis to then the response to the crisis, working with the crew back at Mission Control to eventually bring them safely back to Earth. And in 1995, there was a movie release called Apollo 13. What you may not realize is the weightless scenes in the movie, most of them were actually filmed in weightlessness to make it as authentic as possible on the same NASA KC-135 aircraft that we did in our research. And as it turns out, one of my research flights happened to be the orientation flight for the cast. You might recognize Tom Hanks and Kevin Bacon on the left floating over me in my experiment, and Gary Sinise there on the right, grabbing a chewy fruit out of the air Pac-Man style that I floated across the cabin to him. This is the post-flight photo, which is very telling. All the people in blue are NASA staff. They're either pilots, the flight surgeon on board, or the program director and test director. And the cast and the cinematographer and the director are in the khaki flight suits. You might notice Gary Sinise on, oh, by the way, the nickname of the aircraft is the Vomit Comet. Maybe you've heard about that. I'll admit I barfed with the best of them at points in my career, but more recently, fortunately. Well, but unfortunately for Gary Sinise, he got the Barf Bag of the Day award, which you can see him holding there in the photo. And that was a challenge, but they flew 12 flights altogether to gather more than enough footage to edit in the weightless scenes. So you just never know what happens when you go fly with NASA. Now, fast forward, we've had up to 16 flights before we finally got to the final flight version of the experiment. Here you can see a close-up of the left ventricle of the Utah 100 artificial heart. The atrium's on the left, the aorta is going up on the right in this fluid loop, which had resistance and compliance elements to mimic the resistance and compliance of the blood vessels, so that when you looked at the blood pressure and the blood flow tracings, they looked very, very physiologic. On the left, you see the full payload, the front side of the full payload. So you can see the heart driver in the lower left with the heart's flight suit patch on it, some of the electronics, the recorder, and infusion withdrawal pumps. The back side of the payload was full of Duracell alkaline batteries. because with this particular class of payloads, you not only had to bring your experiment and the microprocessor to run it, but you also had to bring your own power. So the backbone was a battery box that supplied all the power. All you got at the right time in flight from the flight deck was a turn-on switch, and then the experiment activated itself, and it's supposed to do whatever it was programmed to do, which ours did. So here's the liftoff of STS-95, which notably is the flight that John Glenn flew on. But there was also another crew member named Chiaki Mukai. She was a Japanese cardiovascular surgeon who was also a JAXA astronaut, Japanese Space Agency. Scott Parazinski was another physician astronaut on board. He was an emergency medicine physician, as well as the pilot, co-pilot, the other mission specialists. We had a chance to fly on 2 flights, STS-85 in August of 1997, and then in October of 1998 on STS-95. Here you can see Space Shuttle Discovery, which we flew on both flights, landing after the flight on the landing strip at the Kennedy Space Center. And several weeks later, we got the payload back after it was removed from the cargo bay. And fortunately, we got data that we needed. And if you notice, in red is the data points that were recorded in 0G, and blue are the data points that recorded in 1G upright, which maximizes the hydrostatic pressure inside the ventricle in 1G. And then in between, there are data points from supine posture, which reduces the hydrostatic pressure, but it doesn't go to 0. And as you can see from our ventricular function curve, as this is called, or Frank-Starling curve, for those of you that know cardiac physiology, at the same atrial filling pressure, there is the predicted reduction in stroke volume and cardiac output between the 0G data and the 1G data upright, and between, because you would predict the lower hydrostatic pressure, 1G is the supine data. So we were pleased that the data that we got from orbit after several years of development did confirm our hypothesis, and gives you an appreciation for even subtle effects of hydrostatic pressure that we all experience living in a 1G environment can change if you go somewhere where hydrostatic pressure goes away, such as the microgravity orbital spaceflight. Now, you can also do flight research to address how do you treat medical problems that might come up. In this case, how do you give an effective chest compression when you're weightless, if something happens where a crew member has a cardiac arrest? And that became the Hearts in Space, or excuse me, the Hearts in Space CPR flight program that was started in Utah and then brought to fruition with both some human subject ground data and in-flight data once I got to Louisville. So to do that, we had an instrumented CPR mannequin. If you've had CPR training, I suspect many of you have worked with the CPR mannequin, both to get a sense of what is the correct pressure to press on the sternum, to get a sufficient compression of the sternum that you compress the heart to pump some blood out to maintain some circulating blood flow to take oxygen to the tissues until the heart can be restarted. We instrumented our CPR mannequin both so we could measure instantaneously the depth of compression, which is usually recommended to be about 2 inches, as well as the force of compression. See the force transducer there on the chest of the mannequin. And then again, you can see the instrumentation rack that's recording the data. There's also a ECG simulation monitor, and we tried to synchronize the compressions with the onset of systole or the QRS complex, if you're familiar with electrocardiographs, because of a companion project where we were doing chest compressions in healthy test subjects, but we were only doing partial chest compressions during the systole, during the time the heart beats, to avoid the situation called commotio cordis, which could stop the heart, and which many people learned about for the first time with that very critical situation with Lamar Hamlin, the player for the Buffalo Bills, that in the process of tackling someone got a blow to the sternum at the right time and his heart stopped. Fortunately, medical care was there. He was resuscitated, and following intensive care, he not only was able to resume normal activity, I believe he went back to playing football this past season. Anyhow, so here we are in the airplane trying 4 different techniques for delivering chest compressions. If you've taken CPR training, you're familiar with what's called side straddle, where you're kneeling next to the victim and you're bending over, put your fist together on the sternum, and you give the compressions. What you take for granted when this happens in 1G is that gravity holds the victim down and gravity holds the rescuer down, so that when the rescuer delivers the force of the chest compression, that force is transmitted to the sternum and can compress the heart to deliver a stroke volume to try to keep the patient alive until the heart can be restored. What happens in 0G, however, the instant that you try to deliver the chest compression, Newton's third law kicks in and the rescuer goes spinning backwards unless they are restrained. And so you can see here in this example, this rescuer has a waist restraint belt, which was one of the techniques we looked at. In this case, the rescuer has 2 additional restraints that go over the shoulder and strap down on the opposite side of the victim, providing a counterforce so that the force of the chest compression will be better transmitted to the sternum of the victim. And then here you can see a third technique, which I only recommend doing 0G, called vertical CPR, where you, in this orientation, it looks like you're doing a handstand on the victim with your hands again on their sternum and your feet against an opposing surface that can provide the counterforce so that when you push down, the force does get transferred appropriately to the sternum. And then a fourth technique, which is called a modified Heimlich maneuver, or more commonly a backward bear hug, where you would float up behind the victim after you've made your assessment that yes, the heart has stopped and you need to give chest compressions to restore partial circulation until other crew members can come and start a resuscitation procedure to restart the heart. And so you wrap your arms around the patient with their back to your chest, and then you clasp your fists over their sternum, so higher than when you're giving a Heimlich maneuver, and then you pull your wrist toward yourself to compress the chest that way to deliver the chest compression. And here's looking at the data that's recorded. In the green is the force of chest compression, and the red is the depth of chest compression. You can see the ECG pattern in yellow, and what we're trying to do was time our chest compressions to every third QRS complex to be consistent with another protocol we were anticipating testing in the future. In the purple, you see the acceleration profile of the airplane. And on the left, you're during the hypergravity period of the roller coaster that you're flying on the airplane. So it gets almost up to 2Gs, but then in a very short period of time, in a few seconds, it drops down to 0G, and that's the lower part there, which lasts in the NASA airplane about 20 seconds. And then as they pull out and up in that to get ready to create the next maneuver, you start a period of about 40 seconds of hypergravity again. Now, when you look at the data we collected, this is the force of chest compression for the 4 different techniques. And we had 4 rescuers, each doing all 4 techniques. And so this is their integrated data. And you can see that within reason, especially given the error bars, each technique we tried delivered just under 100 pounds of force, which would be quite adequate. Now, when you look at data, you have to look at it in different ways. As you can see, these were the 4 rescuers that were on the flights. On the left, you got an old short guy, and then you got a tall young guy, and then you got a short young guy, and then you got a tall old guy. You might expect that the strength capabilities of each of those people would vary, but also, as you can see, especially for vertical CPR and some of the others, the size of the rescuer may influence your data. So this is 2 diagrams that emphasize that point. On the left is what's called a box plot, scatter plot, and you can see, consistent with the previous graph, the peak force of compression. If you lump the data by chest compression technique, it all looks pretty reasonable. On the other hand, if you lump the data for all 4 techniques by rescuer, it's clear that the shorter rescuers didn't create nearly the peak force of chest compression than the taller rescuers did. So it's important to recognize that the physical size of the person is one of the things that's going to influence how effective your chest compressions can be. And of course, the lesson there is, if you're going to have a cardiac arrest in this patient, make sure that your partner is much bigger than you are to hopefully get good chest compressions until it. We've done lots of other human subject research to understand cardiovascular response to 0G, which is a whole nother story. But what you see here are 4 different test subjects that have multiple physiologic pressure sensors in them to measure the pressure in their chest, in their abdomen, to measure their venous pressure in the superior vena cava just above the heart. So it's very close. That's referred to as the central venous pressure, as well as peripherally down in their ankle and the saphenous vein. And all this data is being recorded continuously as you go from 1G to hyper G to 0G many times. And then what we did was, for each set of 10 parabola, we had the test subject go from launch posture, which is laying down but with your legs up, like when you're sitting in one of the seats in the space shuttle, or now how the astronauts will sit in the Orion when that flies, laying supine, laying 6-degree head down tilt, which is an analog model that's used to study the headward shifted fluid that occurs with sustained microgravity, and then in upright seated, you can see there. Now, let's shift from trying to understand how the body and the cardiovascular system responds to the weightlessness of spaceflight, and I'm realizing time is short. So let me just say that we're working on surgical techniques. We've done a lot on the airplane. Can you suction? Can you recover the fluid? Can you take the surgical fluid waste and create it into sterile water or saline again? And can you attach a surgical containment dome to a patient in 0G? And then using suborbital flight to test things out. So here you can see one of our surgical containment domes as it is boosting up into space inside the cabin of Spaceship Two. We got good pressure and flow data through several conditions to show that our surgical fluid management system does work as intended in 0G as it does in 1G. And just one other project to mention, and that is, how do you do a blood transfusion if somebody has a traumatic event where they lose blood, or if they have an exposure to cosmic radiation that causes radiation-induced anemia? Our project team at Louisville is working on creating dehydrated red blood cells that would come in a package like this, where you got the red blood cells on one side, the rehydration solution on the other side. When you need it, all you do is squeeze the side with a rehydration solution. It opens the seals between the two. It rehydrates the red blood cells, and in a minute you're ready to hook up your IV line and start the transfusion. And this is what this pack might look like in the medical kit. We're getting ready to test this out during a suborbital flight to document the adequate rehydration and extended zero G, as well as test for the adequacy of the hemoglobin to transport oxygen, and also to fix some of the cells to see if the red blood cells that are rehydrated in zero G look like the red blood cells that are rehydrated in 1G, and that they're acceptable and safe for transfusion. And so we're getting ready to do that. And sorry I had to rush through, but thanks for the opportunity from all the project team, and share your adventures and share them again and again with great crews of people. So with that, if there is time for questions, I'll be happy to take them. And thanks again for your interest in this topic.
Thank you. I've got a few questions. One of them is, how does this research translate to civilian use?
Many ways, and is frequently the case. Sometimes the special requirements of space flight require that you develop a new technology or technique that's appropriate for spaceflight, but oftentimes that can be adapted to help the other 5 billion plus of us left back on the planet. As far as the red blood cell technique for preservation red blood cells, I should mention a couple of unique characteristics, one of which is the dehydrated red blood cells do not have to be refrigerated like standard blood is when you donate blood for transfusion. The other thing is that blood for transfusion, besides being refrigerated physiologically, is only effective for about 42 days. And after that, it has to be discarded. The red blood cells, so far, we have real-time data that show that they are physically viable after rehydration after 4 years of storage. And that's not only more than enough to provide transfusion therapy on a round trip to Mars. Essentially, it could provide transfusion therapy anywhere you are. You think of austere environments or difficult environments like forward battle casualty treatment. You think of rural clinics that may not be able to have a blood bank given the current collection and storage techniques. Well, they could have these packets of dehydrated red blood cells just on the shelf and rehydrate them, set up the high-V line, and start the transfusion.
Nice.
And lots of other things. So that's an example of how what we do is inspired for spaceflight is translated to use on the Earth.
Okay, and I had one more question I'm going to try to get into just before we wrap up. For a long-term mission, such as potentially to Mars, what would be your recommended medical team? Physicians, surgeons, other specialists, and how many of each specialty?
Well, you might anticipate that I have a bias to answer that question. Certainly there has to be a crew medical officer, and Murphy's Law being what it is, it's the crew medical officer who's going to get sick and need medical attention. So you also should have a second crew medical officer.
Yeah, I've seen that movie.
Yes. And then you can get into very lively conversations. Should both crew medical officers be physicians? If they are, what type of physician should they be? I think you'll get a lot of people that will vote for a emergency medical physician who has experience with trauma care and critical care. There are additional considerations that the second crew medical officer wouldn't necessarily need to be a physician, but would be a crew member who's undergone very intensive training equivalent to an EMT person that is an emergency responder. So that hopefully between those two people and the resources that you have, you can respond to a medical incident immediately. Because one of the things that is not obvious to a lot of people is that the communications from the Earth to the Moon at a minimum, just because of the physical distance, is at least a second and a half. And in a crisis situation, that might not be sufficient responsiveness from the flight surgeons and mission control to guide them through what's needed. And as you go to Mars, depending on the relationship between the Earth and Mars and their respective orbits, it could be anywhere from 5 minutes to I think 25 or 30 minutes transit time. The crews are going to have to be able to be autonomous, updating mission control when they can, but they can't count on mission control to guide them through an emergency situation. So I would vote for a critical care trauma surgeon and someone that has the equivalent training to an EMS technician.
I will not disagree with you because I am certain you know far more than I do about it. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us this afternoon or this morning, wherever you may be. I think we've reached afternoon in Texas.
Yes.
And just really appreciated your insights and looking forward to getting an opportunity to see you in the future. Thank you very much.
Welcome. Thanks very much. And thanks for your interest, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye. And for everyone else, we are going to be going back into waiting mode. We've got our next speaker is heading up, and we'll start up again at 1:30.